From Community Public Radio, this is the CPR News. From New York, I'm Don DeBar. Today we go to Esteli, Nicaragua, to speak with journalist Stephen Sefton about a number of elections that are coming up in Central and South America over the next few weeks. Stephen, it's nice to talk with you, and I had let our audience know that we actually recorded this conversation or something along the same lines yesterday, that being Thursday the 29th. And due to a technical error by yours truly, it wasn't usable. And so we're going to have to do it again. And so we're talking, first of all, thank you for your patience, in the face of my incompetence, and also for, the work that goes into doing this stuff and staying on top of it. And, we'll go, again, looking at the elections in, Central South America, Caribbean that are set up, particularly some important ones in Nicaragua on the 7th, in Argentina on the 14th, and then in the 21st in Chile, Venezuela also on the 21st, and on the 28th in Central America, excuse me, in Honduras. And then finally, I think we will close with Nicaragua if we get that far. We did not in the first take of this program, but let's see how it goes. So we wanted to start, I guess, with Argentina, correct?
Yeah, and thank you for your patience, Don. And as you say, November is a very busy week. A very busy month in terms of elections in Central and South America. As you say, it probably makes sense to take them in chronological order except for Nicaragua, because I think we should dedicate a whole program to talking about that election. Maybe we could do that next week.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
And the elections in Argentina are legislative elections in which the country will renew 127 of 250 seats in the lower house. They have a similar system to the United States with an equivalent of the House of Representatives and a Senate.
Yeah, they call it a Chamber of Deputies, where the House of Representatives is, and the National Senate. Yeah,
right. So these legislative elections are for about half the seats in the lower chamber and a third of the seats in the Senate. There are 72 seats in the Senate, and 24 of those are up for election this time round. And the two main forces involved in the elections are the coalition of the governing Frente de Todos, which is in English you might translate that as the Front for Everyone. And the opposition right-wing coalition is called Juntos por el Cambio, Together for Change. But obviously they're talking about positive, progressive change. They're talking about turning the clock back in an extremely reactionary way, just as they did under the government of Mauricio Macri between whenever it was 2015, 2019. And so you'd think in the current circumstances the contest would be an easy win for the progressive forces, but in fact the progressive forces of the Frente de Todos got a shock in the primary elections that were held in Argentina a couple of months ago. And in those primary elections, what they do is the people vote to confirm the support for specific candidates, who then go on to be the candidates in the real elections that are going to take place this November the 14th. And the the Juntos por el Cambio, the right-wing coalition, did extremely well in those primary elections. They actually did better in many places than the progressive Frente de Todos coalition. And the reason for that is partly because the Frente de Todos, although it's composed of Cristina Fernández de Kirchner's group, who are very progressive, they're in coalition with somewhat more centrist and even, I'd argue, centre-right forces. For example, the political grouping around Sergio Massa, which is a kind of centre-right social democrat group. And they after they were elected, President Alberto Fernandez won the elections a year or so ago, a couple of years ago, and he has not implemented progressive policies, and his policies have been a kind of austerity light, in large part because of the dire economic legacy that he inherited from Mauricio Macri, including record debt to the International Monetary Fund, who are imposing their demands on the government in exchange for, as part of the conditions for the loans that they made under Mauricio Macri. Right. So, to be fair to Fernandez, he has to some extent been a hostage of that legacy from Mauricio Macri, but also in terms of his own political orientation and his alliance, his de facto alliance with Sergio Massa's grouping, they tend to counteract the progressive influence, the more progressive influence of the group in the Frente de Todos led by Cristina Fernández de Kirchner. But on top of that, they also had to deal with the effects of the COVID-19 outbreak in Argentina, in which they have not done very well. They have not been very successful. Right. And so, for all those reasons, they as an electoral coalition did not very well in the primaries. So it remains to be seen whether the Argentinian electorate are going to confirm the vote, the results of the primaries in these upcoming elections in November the 14th. And it's not at all clear that the Frente de Todos is going to do well enough to roll back the potential gains for the right-wing Juntos por el Cambio group. Yeah. So, and we'll just have to see what happens there in Argentina.
So, let me ask you a question. So, the primary elections there, are they open? So, in other words, here in the United States, in some states like New York, for example, if there's a primary election, this is a mechanism by which the Democrats pick their candidates, the Republicans pick their candidates. You know, there are all kinds of contradictions in there. But if I'm a Republican voter, I can only vote in the Republican primary. If I'm a Democratic voter, I can only vote in the Democratic primary. That's not the case across the country, but that's the case in New York. And I'm wondering, in Argentina, is it what they call open primaries where I can go vote for anybody, or is it you have to be enrolled in the party or the grouping that you're selecting a candidate for?
No, my understanding is that you can only vote in the primaries for the party of which you're. Well, I suppose obviously they're going to be loads of people who are not members of parties. So, and in fact, I don't really know, but my understanding is that people the primaries are intended for people who support that given party to vote.
So the reason I ask, I'm looking at something. It says the turnout was 66.21%, which they called the lowest participation since the implementation of the present system 10 years ago. So, and it was the least concurred, or the lowest turnout since the return of democracy, as they put it in 1983. Now, the reason I ask is if it's as you suggest, that you suspect that you have to vote, you have to be enrolled in the party that you're selecting a candidate for. the low turnout for the incumbent party doesn't really mean a lot. It's like, oh, that's who they chose. Okay, I don't have to go vote. And it may not be indicative of what's coming. That's just my point. If it's an open primary, however, it's a dry run for the general election, and they ought to be very nervous about it.
Yeah, I'm not on Argentina, but I'm reading commentary from people who are very familiar with the Argentinian political and electoral scene, and there seemed to be a consensus that it was not good for the Frente de Todos.
Gotcha. So it probably was at least somewhat open primary, as they call it. Yeah, well, we'll see.
Yes,
yeah.
And that that there's a kind of similar situation, and with different aspects in Chile. And in Chile, they have their presidential elections on the 21st of November. And of course, those elections are taking place after, as well as against the backdrop of the COVID-19 outbreak, they're also taking place against the backdrop of almost 3 years of extremely strong street demonstrations by people demanding systemic change, change to the constitution, changes to the way that changes to Chilean policing, changes to the education system, changes to the pension system, and those massive demonstrations that were severely repressed under the government of current right-wing President Sebastián Piñera. They in the end, they were successful because they forced the authorities to concede a consultative referendum on whether or not the country should hold a constituent assembly, and the progressive forces won that referendum. They got their constituent assembly, vote for the constituent assembly. The progressive forces got a majority, and things. It looked as though they had sufficient momentum to carry that whole process forward and actually carry out radical changes that would completely overthrow the kind of the institutional regime that was inherited from the Pinochet dictatorship,
right,
and which the presidencies of Ricardo Lagos initially and then subsequently Michelle Bachelet failed to significantly change. Right. And I don't think that's too harsh a judgment. And certainly in the case of Michelle Bachelet, she had 2 periods of government in the presidency, and she completely failed to reform the vicious, sadistic culture of the Chilean police, the so-called carabinieri. She failed to carry out adequate reform of the pension system, and she failed to carry out adequate reform of the education system. And those were the fundamental demands of people who are out demonstrating in the streets over the last 2 or 3 years. So what that means is that although there was tremendous impetus for radical progressive forces that resulted in substantial representation, a majority representation in the Constituent Assembly in Chile, that impetus is kind of divided again in a very similar way to the way the political sympathies lie in Argentina. You have quite a strong, solid right-wing bloc with something over around 35%. And you also have a strong social democrat bloc, and then you have what's still to be clearly defined in terms of a progressive bloc in Chile. So, although at the moment there's quite a lot of optimism in Chile that the presidential candidate of the progressive forces, a relatively young man called Gabriel Boric, and it does look as though he stands a real chance of certainly getting into the second round of the presidential elections, because what usually happens in Chile is that there's no clear winner after the first round, and it subsequently goes to a second round election. And it's possible that Gabriel Boric will get sufficient votes to go into the runoff against the right-wing candidate, whom I can't remember the name of the right-wing candidate. And if he does manage to get into the runoff, there's a good chance that enough Social Democrats will vote for him against the right-wing candidate that he would end up winning the presidency. But again, we'll just have to see, because there's the progressive forces have suffered a series of setbacks, largely self-inflicted, over the last 2 or 3 months as a result of arguments and differences within their progressive bloc in the Constituent Assembly, and that has not gone down well with the electorate overall. But we'll see what happens on November the 21st in Chile.
Yeah. Now we're talking about Juan Morano, right? Was the candidate of the right? Is that who you're talking about?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's Chile, and also we're looking at Venezuela.
Yeah, the same day that Chile has its presidential elections, there are very important elections also in Venezuela. Not presidential elections, but elections for 23 what they call governorships, I suppose, as both the actual governorships and the legislative bodies that are an institutional part of the way Venezuela's different provinces and departments run themselves.
Right.
And at the same time as those 23 governorships and their legislatures are up for election, there's also an election for all 335 municipalities in the country. So they'll be electing 335 mayors and all the councillors that are also part of the municipal governing structure. So it's a hugely important, both a huge logistical exercise to actually carry out those elections, and also a hugely important political event in terms of what will be the political complexion of the country over the next 4 or 5 years. And so one would expect that, given the effects of US sanctions on Venezuela's economy and the incredible hardship and suffering that people in Venezuela have suffered as a result of US sanctions, Canadian sanctions, sanctions from the European Union, you'd think that the opposition would practically have a walkover, but that's not the case. And the reason for that is because, in part, the national government under President Maduro has managed to combat the worst effects of the sanctions imposed on the country illegally by the United States and its allies by means of it consolidating and strengthening the strategic relationship that Venezuela has developed over the last decade or more with the Russian Federation and with the People's Republic of China. And more recently, the government has been extremely successful in developing a relationship with Iran that has enabled the country to actually revive its refining capacity and its oil-producing capacity that had been really severely disrupted as a result of the aggressive sanctions applied by the United States government and its allies. So what that has meant is that the economy is beginning to recover from those effects. People sense the recovery, so that's one aspect of the background to the elections. The other important aspect, as you and I have noted many, many times in the past, Don, is that the Venezuelan opposition hate each other more than they hate the United Socialist Party of Venezuela and its leadership. Diosdado Cabello, Tania Diaz, Nicolas Maduro himself. And the Venezuelan opposition itself is divided into the extreme opposition that's supported by the United States and what one might call a loyal constitutional opposition that accepts Venezuela's constitution, accepts Nicolas Maduro as the legitimate president and his government as the legitimate government. And it's that opposition that are participating and giving enormous legitimacy to these elections that are going to be held for the governorships and municipalities in Venezuela on November the 21st. So whereas the US supported opposition that still has this absurd clown-like figure, Juan Guaido, an extremely sinister figure, of course, but somebody whose position is so absurd that it's impossible to take seriously. But he is still, for example, the representative of Juan Guaido, supported by the United States, represents Venezuela in the Organization of American States, even though the genuine government of Venezuela left the Organization of American States a couple of years ago. So it's in that context that one can see that these elections, the mere fact that they're being held, and the fact that the majority of Venezuela's right-wing opposition are participating in those elections, just make U.S. policy and the whole figure of Juan Guaido look completely stupid.
Again, against all of that, in the midst of all of the sanctions that the country's economy has had to labor under, for now, 19 years or something. They started adding them after the attempted coup back in 2002, was it? They've built since 3,700,000 new housing units. Okay, that's more than 1 for every 10 people in the country. That's amazing.
Yeah, and apart from the housing, they've also maintained they've maintained their social spending, which has been, and the last time I looked, it was over 50% of the national budget.
Right.
And all that social spending has been maintained despite all the difficulties imposed by the United States and its allies. Yep. And that's another of the reasons why the PSUV, the United Socialist Party of Venezuela, is likely to do very well in these elections. They might not. They might lose ground in some areas, in a few governorships, and in a not insignificant number of municipalities. Yeah. But overall, the PSUV looks set to win a majority of municipalities and a good majority of the governorships. So, yep. And that'll be a tremendous political achievement on the part of Nicolas Maduro and his team.
Yeah, pretty amazing in the face of all of the, look, the empire has been trying to take that government down since Hugo Chavez sat in that seat, and as a matter of fact, dragged him out of the presidential palace, and he almost got a free helicopter ride to the Gulf of Mexico or wherever they were taking him. So, the Pacific Ocean.
Yeah, so and that's the situation in Venezuela, and and if we put that in a regional context, and that's an indication of how much. And I think I commented to you the last time we were speaking, or the time before, that it's absolutely clear in the current regional context that the United States is no longer the dominant power in Latin America and the Caribbean. And that may sound stupid, but if you look at the results of what's happening right now in these, and the likely outcomes of these elections, the fact that Venezuela has survived, the fact that Cuba has survived, and that Cuba's GDP is projected to grow over the next year or 2 years. The ruling United Socialist Party of Venezuela is almost certainly going to do very well in these elections on the 21st. The progressive candidates in Chile and Argentina, and in Argentina it's not so clear, but in Chile it's very clear that the progressive candidate is likely to present a very serious threat, a much more serious threat that genuinely progressive forces in Chile have ever presented, ever since the end of the dictatorship, to continuing right-wing and centrist social democrat rule in Chile. And that'd be a huge change. The mere fact that that's happening And also you have a similar situation in Honduras. The mere fact that all that is happening indicates that the United States is no longer the power that it was. Right. In the region. And you can see this very clearly in Honduras, for example. The reason that Juan Orlando Hernandez won the last elections back in whenever it was, 2017, I think it was that he stole those elections were very clearly stolen. Even the European Union observers and even the Organization of American States observers said that those elections were seriously flawed, but they ended up accepting the result. And so now you have the progressive candidate Xiomara Castro, the wife of former President Manuel Zelaya, who was overthrown in a coup supported by the United States in 2009 under Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton. She is now the candidate for the presidency this year in Honduras, along with, in coalition with a kind of centrist social democrat guy called Salvador Nasralla. And they are likely to win again, just as they did in 2017. So the question this year will be, will the right wing be able to steal the vote again like they did in 2017? Well, we don't know, but what is for sure is that Xiomara and Castro and her running mate Salvador Nasralla are definitely going to win those elections. So, and that's just another example of the way United States policy has completely failed to engage with their right-wing allies in the region in a successful way, so as to prevent popular support expressing itself in elections and in other forms, on the streets in Chile, for example, overthrowing the coup in Bolivia, for example, and the United States that simply does not have the power and influence that it used to have. And these elections in Argentina, Chile, Venezuela, and Honduras are going to demonstrate that. Again, do we have time to talk about Nicaragua?
I think let's take a look at what's left here, because I think we are pretty close to out of time. We got about 2 minutes. Okay, so yeah, and I'd just like to comment that with luck we'll be able to talk more about the election in Nicaragua next week before the election's held on the 7th. But again, here in Nicaragua, you have a situation where the progressive revolutionary government under President Daniel Ortega is enjoying overwhelming support. They have polls indicate that they have over 70% support, despite everything that the United States have done to try and discredit the government, to try and overthrow it in the 2018 regime change attempt. And Nicaragua is another example of the way the United States simply does not have the power and influence that it used to have in the region. They pushed pretty hard. Was it 2019, trying to take down Nicaragua? I mean, they did, first of all, the war. Right after 1979 was the Sandinista Revolution, and the U.S. went on a war footing basically pretty quickly after that, and that raged, until 1990 or something, when they finally had that election and the right wing was planted in place, Violeta Chiamaro, the whole bit. The U.S. thought they had it, and the Sandinistas are now, in the state that you describe in terms of popularity, overwhelmingly popular, with an overwhelming portion of the population, including some members of the national bourgeoisie.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And that's another expression of what we've seen in Venezuela, where the opposition hate each other more than they hate the progressive government.
And with good cause.
Right.
I think we got to wrap it up where we're at that point. So I'd like to go into more detail specifically about Nicaragua next week, and it'll be timely for the election, which will be a week from this weekend. It'll be the 7th,
November
8th, or whatever. Yeah,
yeah.
The 7th. So we'll speak with you then, and we appreciate all your work, especially for having to do this particular interview twice.
Okay, thanks a million, Don. Take care now.
You too, Stephen. Thank you. And that's all the news we have for you right now. For Community Public Radio, I'm Don DeBar in New York. Thanks for listening.